Good evening, good morning to everybody. Welcome to our third webinar on gender mainstreaming. This is our gender mainstream, our webinar on where we will be discussing the Gender at Work framework that is part of the elements that we will be discussing. Let me tell you a little bit about how the webinar will work. Then we will introduce Aruna Rao, who's our panelist, and then we will have the presentation, and then we will have time for questions and answers. So this is where about the webinar and how this will function. We have already used the same system WebEx in our former webinar, and as you can see, you have logged in through the invitation, and we have and you can see the screen where we will be presenting. And we have we will ask you to kindly mute your microphones during the presentation so that we have less problem with sound and there's no background noise. We will also you have also connected to audio, and we will disconnect video so that the presentation runs more smoothly. We also have a chat function where we will ask you to post your questions through this chat function, and we will be checking it so that we can have a question and answer section at the end of the presentation. Also, sorry, I wanted to let you know that this recording, as always, will be this presentation will be recorded. Sorry, and it will be available in our e-learning campus in the course site, and it will also be available in our YouTube channel. So we will send you right after the presentation. We will send you the link so that you can listen to it afterwards. So today, as you know, my name is Alicia Ziffer. I will be the moderator for today's webinar, and I'm also the training program coordinator at the training center, and I'm also coordinating this course in gender mainstreaming. Today, we are very glad to have Aruna Rao with us present. Aruna co-founded Gender at Work with David Gallagher in 2001. She's executive director and ex officio board member. Aruna has a long-standing experience in gender equality. She was a practitioner in residence in the Global Gender Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University from 2012 to 2013. She was also the leader of the BRAC Gender Team in Bangladesh and the Populations Council Asia Regional Coordinator for Gender and Development based in Bangkok from 2084 to 2019. She was a board chair of Civicus, the World Alliance for Civic Participation, and the board chair of the Association for Women's Rights in Development, and also a visiting scholar at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad. Besides all this, she has a very long experience in gender mainstreaming, in gender equality issues, working on different institutional settings. I'm very glad that we can have her for our course, that we can listen to her firsthand, and so that she can present to us the Gender at Work framework. I think this is a great opportunity. We will be discussing this framework along the course, and we are very glad to have Aruna with us. So without further ado, I will give the microphone to Aruna. Please send us your questions through the chat function, sorry, so we can afterwards have some time to pose them to Aruna. So I will change the presentation. And here we are. One moment. Aruna, if you want to, we will be done in 1 minute. Here we are. I will mute my mic, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you this morning. What I'm going to do is to give you a sense of what the Gender at Work Analytical Framework is, and how we can use it, and to go through an example of a large program in India, and use the framework to really understand the change strategy in that program and what resulted from it. So let me turn to the framework itself. As you see, the framework is really addressed to the question, what are we trying to change? And what it does is that it highlights the different domains of change, where change needs to happen for gender equality to be achieved. The framework is built to some extent on the work of Ken Wilber, who developed the integral framework, but it's quite different from the integral framework as well. It's built using two axes. So you have the x-axis that goes from informal on the one hand to formal on the other, and the y-axis that goes from individual to systemic. So let me look then at the different domains here. Let's look at what's on the right-hand side of the framework. What's on the right-hand side, or the formal side of the framework, has to do with things that are measurable, things that are concrete, that we can see, that we can touch, and changes both at the individual level and at the systemic level. So what is it in terms of individual? What are we talking about when we say resources at the individual level? So it can be in a community, it can be things like health services, it can be things like microcredit, and other kinds of, access to basic services that are measurable, that are tangible. Those are resources. Now, at the lower right-hand quadrant of what's on the formal side of the framework is rules and policies about that really determine access to resources, that determine who's eligible to get what, and as well as accountability. And those are, as I said, they're on the formal side of the framework because they're clear. They're things that we can see, we can measure, and that are quite concrete. When you go to the left-hand side of the framework, this is the informal domain. And at an individual level, one of the things that we see that really has to change is consciousness. People's consciousness, people's awareness, capabilities, their leadership abilities. Those are all the kinds of things at the individual level that have to change for gender equality to happen. But as I said, because it's on the informal side of the framework, those are not things that are necessarily obvious. You can't really see them, and it's difficult to measure those kinds of things. But nevertheless, very important. At the lower left-hand side quadrant is the quadrant where we actually focus a lot of attention, and that has to do with what is both informal and systemic. And those are things like, in communities, there are things like social norms, values that are attributed to women and women's rights, things like values and norms about who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, and deep structures and ways of organizing things, ways of giving symbolic importance to things or devaluing things or excluding voices and people that are not necessarily obvious, but are definitely operating in any society. Now, when you look at the Gender at Work framework, you can use the framework to look at what we want to change, both within an organization as well as within a community. And often what we do at Gender at Work is to look at the relationship between an organization that's trying to make change in a community and looking at it with this framework and what is actually happening in a community. So what it does is that it highlights the role of social institutions, which are really rules that are informal and formal in maintaining and reproducing women's subordination, women's unequal position in society. But also you can adapt it in a way that looks at exclusionary rules that apply to different kinds of groups of people, ethnicities, races, religions, people of different kinds of sexualities. So you can use that framework to look at those as well. It clearly tries to link organizational change on the one hand with changes in these sort of deeper institutions or rules of the game and gender equality. And very clearly, by looking at it, you can see that it looks at different domains of change. Although when you look at the framework like this, it looks like these are all separate kind of boxes. But in fact, in actual life, they merge into each other. They blur. So if you look at the axis from individual to systemic, it's not only individual to systems. There are all kinds of points along that continuum that include groups of people, that include communities, that include certain kinds of organizations and movements, all the way to systemic issues such as how are resources allocated, how is political representation designed, so it's all sort of within that continuum. And from informal to formal, clearly, there are many different sort of points along that continuum as well, where things are, which go from very informal to very formal. So the framework, as I said when we began, was it helps you to think about what is it that we're trying to change. For example, many of you must be familiar with microcredit programs. Now, with microcredit programs, the intervention is focused on the upper right-hand quadrant of the framework. It's a resource. Microcredit programs provide credit, and as they were originally founded, provide credit to women primarily who don't have any collateral to show to get the credit. Now, there are certain assumptions that are made in microcredit programs, as you'll know. So, for example, if you give women access to credit, they will use the credit in a productive way and thereby increase their income. Another assumption that is made about that is that if women have access to their own income, that they'll have a greater say in decision-making about how to use that income, whether it's household decision-making or other kinds of ways of using that income. And a third assumption or a third link is that women, that by having this decision-making control, that women will be able to shift some of the kinds of strategic barriers that prevent them from making decisions, from exerting their voice, from participating in fora that make a difference to their lives. Now, if you look at those assumptions, now clearly the first one, although one could argue a little bit about this for sure, but clearly the first assumption about microcredit, giving women an access to an income which they wouldn't have had before, does hold up in microcredit schemes. So women have access to credit that they wouldn't have had before. So if you think about programs like Grameen Bank, or you think of BRAC in Bangladesh, those were the organizations that really pioneered the work on microcredit. Now, it's also true that the intervention or access to microcredit enables women to have greater, their status within the household increases because they are seen as adding value to the household. So it begins to touch on that lower left-hand quadrant, so that women's value itself, the image of women's values begins to shift because they're seen to be as productive assets to that household itself. Does that necessarily mean that they have decision-making voice in how the income is used? The studies show that to some extent they do, that to some extent they're able to influence decisions around how income is spent related to their children. Now, beyond that, there's no evidence really to show that that women are able to, through that particular intervention, change some of these fundamental social norms and deep structures that are barriers to women's advancement. So that's an example to show how an intervention could start in one quadrant, but then sooner or later kind of touches this other quadrant, social norms and deep structures, which is a fundamental quadrant that needs to change for gender equality. So I've gone over the quadrants. The top two quadrants are individual. The bottom two quadrants are systemic. And just to remind you that for gender equality change to happen, change needs to take place in all four quadrants. So if change takes place only in one quadrant, so for example, if you have a policy on gender equality in an organization, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are resources to back up that policy and staff who are able to implement that policy, or people who really believe or have the consciousness that this is an important thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that within the organization itself that power dynamics are working in a way that enable that policy to actually get implemented. So you need to have change happen in all four domains. Now, it doesn't mean that any one organization has to work in all four domains. So you could say, well, we're a health organization, and what we do is provide maternal and child health care. So, we are intervening at the top right-hand quadrant. That is true. But again, when you do that, what you need to take into account is what are the kinds of systemic barriers that will make it difficult for women and children and men to access the kinds of health services you are making available. So that again touches on the social norms and deep structures. So the framework can be used to map a theory of change. So you can say, well, we want to enter into the quadrant on resources. We want to provide health services. And the way in which we're going to do that in order to be really successful and change, say, maternal health is going to involve change in other domains. And so you can begin to draw a theory of change using the framework, and then you can go back and check whether, in fact, the assumptions you made about how change happens actually work out. So let me turn to an example of how the framework was used. So Alicia, if you move to the example on Dalit women's accountability. So I've outlined these points in this slide, and the next one, and the next one. So now I want to tell you a story of a program in India where, and then use the framework to show the theory of change and how the framework can be used to look at how to make change happen in this program. The program is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. India is one of the few countries in the world where the right to work is a constitutional guarantee. And there is a national program, it covers all the states in India, where which ensures 100 days of paid employment to each rural household per year. And in this program there is a 33% reservation for women at equal wage between men and women. And there is a provision that if an applicant has applied for work and does not get work within a certain period, then they can claim unemployment allowance. And the program also guarantees that at each work site, there will be facilities such as drinking water, there'll be shade, there'll be childcare facilities, and healthcare for the workers. Now, as you can imagine, this kind of work is very hard work. It's it's like digging ponds, digging canals. It's literally moving mud and moving earth. Many food for work programs are like this. So that's the theory. That's what the program says it will do. Now, the reality is that for it's meant to target people who need the income the most, primarily agricultural workers during the off season, who can have access to an income, and certainly for women. In India, as you know, Dalit women are very disadvantaged, and they who need this program the most, who need access to this income the most, often are not aware of the program itself, and that these are their rights, that they have a right to demand work. They don't have access to information about how to claim their rights, how to claim their entitlements. And Gender at Work worked in one state in India on this program in a number of districts, which were extremely poor districts, which were not high performing in terms of women's participation in the national program. Now, in some states in India, women's participation in the program is quite high. So, for example, in Kerala, women's participation is close to about 60 to 70%. But in this part of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India, the women's participation was less than about 30%. So actually, in the districts where we were working it was even lower. So women's participation was about 21% of the workforce. The work is it's manual work, as I said, and even though the program says that women and men have access to all the different jobs in the program, in fact, there was this kind of bias in terms of the way, the program implementers, and they would only give the lowest manual jobs to women. And they would give any kind of semi-skilled jobs to men, which means that women were earning the bottom of the bottom wages, and men were earning higher wages. And why was that? That was because of the assumption that women who were, are from this low, it's really not even a caste, sort of outside of the caste system, but from this group, who were semi-literate, could not do any other kind of work except this kind of manual work. Facilities which were supposed to be provided at the work site were not provided. And there really was no accountability to the workers in terms of, actually ensuring that all of these provisions were in place. So let's turn to the next slide. Alicia? Yeah. So I'll just walk you through this, right? This is sort of, this slide is about how would we use the gender at work analytical framework to how we actually did use it to diagnose the issues and problems, and then build a strategy of change in the program. And the arrows really sort of show the connections between the different strategies. Now, the first thing that we in the program, and the program was run by Gender at Work in collaboration with 4 local organizations, some of which worked with women and some of which didn't work specifically on women's issues, some of which worked with the program and some of which didn't have an experience of working with the program. So there were a number of layers to this program. One was involving women in this Manrega, the Right to Work program, but another one was also building a connection between these 4 organizations and their members who were women who were eligible for this program. So one of the first things, if you look on the left-hand quadrant, the individual informal quadrant, the upper left-hand quadrant, the first thing that together the program designers decided was important was to build the awareness among women of their rights under this program. So in fact, to actually talk to them about what they were eligible for, and then build their sense of, build their own sense of confidence, build their own sense of capacity about how to actually do the work. And I'll go into that in a minute. And then the third piece was about using processes such as action reflection processes, which really enabled the women themselves to kind of build relationships among each other, have a feeling that they were a group together, and for the organizations also themselves to feel connected to each other and as a community. So building the women's work capacities had to do with one example that was used in this program was to train women in how to do the quote unquote technical work of measuring the earth, because payment is made on the basis of how much earth you have actually moved. So to actually measure that. So there was a training program that was started to help women. So then you start at the upper left-hand quadrant. You move to the upper right-hand quadrant. What does that enable women to do? So you enable Dalit and low caste and Muslim women to get job cards. If you have a job card, it means that you have access to the program. To set up bank accounts so that the money from your work can be deposited directly into your own bank account. And because of the kind of training that was provided to women, it enabled them to get work, including these supervisory positions, which were previously only given to men. Um, and let me go to the lower right-hand quadrant. All of this was enabled because, as I described right in the beginning, there was an act of parliament which made this program possible, which actually made it a constitutional right to 100 days of work per year on demand for agricultural laborers throughout India. So as this program began and as these different innovations were tried out by these 4 organizations and Gender at Work, different kinds of things happened. Women built a union to advocate for better access to different kinds of jobs. And most importantly, some of the aspects of that lower left-hand quadrant started to shift a bit. And of course, those types of changes don't happen overnight. It takes a long time. But the process involved in this program began to shift the kinds of gender and class bias beliefs that on the part of the system managers, that these semi-literate women in fact were capable of doing different kinds of work, not only the lowest, on the rung of ladder. And they also held the belief that Muslim women wouldn't come out of their homes to do this kind of work. But in fact, the program that we organized Muslim women who needed the work, who wanted the work, who were willing to come out of their homes to do this work. And the processes of solidarity building among the women themselves began to erode some of the caste biases that, even low-caste Hindu women and Muslim women held in relation to Dalit women. So they began to sort of, some of those sort of beliefs and practices, like, a simple practice like accepting water from a Dalit woman. Some of those kinds of things, started to shift. And as the program developed, there was more advocacy done with the state and the central government on the kinds of changes that were needed in this program. And in fact, the Ministry of Rural Development, as a result of what was shown through this program and other kinds of programs like this in India, instigated a new policy of 50% reservation of women in the supervisory category for these jobs. So the arrows, show you some of the directions of the change, and also, as I've spoken about it, show you kind of where it began, what were the assumptions about how change happens in the program, and then what resulted. So I think I should stop here and give time for questions.
Thank you very much, Aruna. Let me check. Thank you very much for such an excellent presentation. Let me check the chat so I can see what participants have been sending in.
Okay.
Please make sure that you write in your questions in the chat function. While we receive the comments and questions, I don't think I have received any yet from the participants. But while we do so, I wanted to ask you if you could have some word of advice or some special comments for participants who are just starting to do gender mainstreaming and would like to use the framework. What would your sort of advice be on this?
As I said when I started, gender mainstreaming, when we talk about gender mainstreaming, we can talk about gender mainstreaming in the context of organizations, and we can talk about gender mainstreaming in the context of programs and work in communities. So whether it is in one or the other, one of the important pieces to always keep in mind And these, I think, people know instinctively, but they don't necessarily make it overt or clear. Is to really try to uncover, the power dynamics that keep certain ways of working, that shape what we value, that shape what is normal, the kinds of values that are hidden, to try to make those more visible, because that really often is, foundational in terms of how much change we're able to achieve either in an organization or in communities. Um, it's much, it's not easy ever, of course, to work on these kinds of changes, but it is much easier to work on, developing a policy or making creating a unit, a gender unit within an organization, to set up gender training. But those kinds of things in and of themselves may increase awareness of the issue, but they don't necessarily help you kind of discover what really needs to change for the power dynamics to shift so that you have more equitable allocation of resources, more equitable voice among different men, women, different genders, in organizational processes, and in how agendas within organizations are shaped and how we think change happens. And within communities, if you look at the kind of change that's been happening, I mean, the World Development Report from 2014, some of the more current work on, that the Gates Foundation and others have been putting out, UN Women puts out, annually with the, in many different ways, looks at the kinds of changes that have in fact happened for women's rights and gender equality. And certainly change has happened. Very important change has happened. But as the WDR, says, some of the things that haven't shifted are this, what they call the sticky things. The sticky things really have to do with this lower left-hand quadrant. Those are the values, the social norms, the discriminatory norms. So there are social norms of all kinds. Some of them are not discriminatory, but some of them are. Some of them are not exclusionary, but some of them are, on the basis of caste, of religion, of class, of gender, of many things. And so, if we're really going to kind of move forward from where we are now, to really shift and change structural dimensions of poverty and inequality, and the very foundations of the way in which we value people, and enable people to participate in shaping their own lives, then these are the kinds of issues that we really need to be focusing on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aruna, for pointing out and sharing these ideas. I want to see, because there's a question from one of the participants. This is what Oyentuya is from Mongolia is saying. It's wonderful framework. Thank you very much. I'm convinced I should use it for our work in the pilot communities of our projects. How would you recommend measuring changes in the 4 quadrants?
Yeah, that's a tough question. There is now more and more work being done on social norms. and on how to measure changes in norms. And just to let you know, as a resource, ODI in the UK has been developing a number of different publications on social norms and measurement of social norms, and are actually building and going to be launching next month a online platform on social norms. So they will look at issues of measurement as well. In the way that we have used it in gendered work, we have used most significant change methodologies, which really enable different kinds of stakeholders to tell their stories of change. So most significant change, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is a methodology which asks people, what changed? What changed for you? And you can ask that of men, of women, of boys, of girls. You can ask that of program participants. You can ask that of the program designers. And everyone will have a different take on what is it that changed. And that's really what we're trying to capture. So, and change could be, changes in all of the other quadrants. Well, what changed was, we found that many more men were aware of the importance of, for example, establishing joint ownership for land when they were registering land. Or we found that that it was very important to have a particular policy in place for everyone to then agree to, that this was the direction an organization was going to go into. So again, looking within an organization or looking within a community, we have used storytelling and stories as a way to try to capture what people themselves authentically feel has changed. And we've encouraged also the writings, particularly in our work in South Africa, encourage the people, the program participants, when we work with different organizations, trade unions or community development organizations, we've encouraged those women themselves to write about their own change. And whether, the change has been personal to them, and what kind of change that is, or whether the change has been organizational. What kind of change has happened within the organization, and what it took for that change to happen. So I think those kinds of qualitative ways of capturing change are very important. There are now other kinds of evaluation methodologies that can analyze large quantities of qualitative data to analyze shifts in values and shifts in norms. And one of our colleagues, actually, Jeremy Holland, who is in the UK, works a lot on those kinds of things.
Thank you very much, Aruna. I think this, besides highlighting a very challenging situation, such as measuring this type of change, also highlights the importance and what we need to do regarding monitoring and evaluation. And we will go into this further along in our course, that we need to measure change and to measure transformative change. We need to challenge ourselves in what tools we're going to develop and use. Sometimes the problem is not with the change itself that we need to measure, but with the lack or the limitation of tools that we have. And I think that these tools that involve storytelling and building stories and the most significant change methodologies are very powerful to be able to document and to evaluate exactly the change that is happening. Let me check if uh, there are more questions. Let's see. I don't see a lot of and I don't see any other questions. I want to motivate anybody if they want to share any comments or questions with Aruna. Meanwhile, I want to excuse Suzette, who has had some troubles connecting to the online platform today. So this is why she's not here today, and she sends her apologies. And she will, of course, listen and to the recording as others who have not participated. Okay. Would you like to make any final comments, Aruna, before closing?
Um, I just I wish all of you a good course. I hope you're enjoying it. This is one tool that I hope you will give some thought to and experiment with. And it is, as I said, it's a framework that helps you think about what it is we're trying to change and to map a theory of change, and then to help you think, go back to see what you mapped and what were your assumptions as you were mapping your theory of change, and then going back to check whether in fact your assumptions were correct, and then if they didn't work out the way you thought, how would you change them? So it's you can experiment with it, you can play with it, and of course any one framework doesn't do everything. This framework doesn't really talk about the how of change so much. It doesn't talk about processes that you can use for different kinds of changes. So it's important not to conflate the different kinds of issues that you are addressing into one, and try to use one framework for that. Because the processes that we use for change are as important as our analysis of what needs to change, and in fact can enable or inhibit our ability to address some of these deep social norms, discriminatory norms, and deep structures. So I hope you will experiment with it. I'd love to hear back from you about what you're finding and how you're using it. And I wish you all the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aruna. I think this has been a very interesting presentation. The framework is very powerful and rich, very versatile. It gives us a lot of information. And as you say, we have one more tool now in our hands that we can use. We have been looking at different tools for gender mainstreaming and gender analysis. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for participating today. Remind everybody that we will be sharing the recording. And next week we will have one more webinar on including men and masculinities. And I'm sure that we will be able to make some interesting linkages between this tool and the inclusion of masculinities and including men in gender mainstreaming. So I will post, as always, the link for the webinar and the exact time and date. It will be next Wednesday evening, Bangkok time this time. And I thank you all, and I wish you a good day, or a good morning to those who are in this side, in either side of the world. Thank you very much, Aruna, and thank you everybody to all the participants, and thanks to Dayan, who has connected and supported us outside very normal working hours.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Goodbye.
Goodbye.